right, good morning. Took me a second to get that computer to wake up. It didn't want to wake up. I said, it's Sunday morning. You got to get up. Y'all have that problem? I have that problem 5 days a week. I don't want to get up. I'm glad I can, though. All right, so Brother Randy's already shared it. Well, then I'm going to be short this morning. I should have left well enough alone, shouldn't I? All right, maybe that'll stay. So we're starting a new series entitled Faith That Triumphs. And we're going to be talking about trust. And we're going to talk about some things that are involved with that trust. So I think it's going to be a good series. I know a lot of the series we've had have been from Paul Chappell. And so now we're going to get, I guess, a little bit of introduction to his son, Larry. So I know I've heard of Paul. I didn't know about Larry, but we'll see. I'm sure it'll be good. Everything I've read so far was good. You all bear with me. This is new to me as it is to you, but we'll get going. I think it'll be a good series for us. Anytime you can trust the Bible or study the Bible and see the examples that are given, and we're going to use a very familiar example today. We're going to be looking at David in Psalm 56 and how kind of a look at his trust that he had to have. And I think we would all agree that David found himself in some positions during his life that he had no other choice but to trust the Lord, did he? Would you all agree with that? I mean, he certainly did. He had his, and we all do. You know, we all have times in our lives that we need to trust more, I guess you could even say. We sing that song, Trust and Obey. And we get the trust, but part of that trust, part of that faith is that the trust portion. You know, is just to trust the Lord that He's going to take care of the situation, even though we can't see the outcome of it. But I'm going to go into Psalm 56, and we'll read there. So I will say one thing about the print in my book. It's borderline small. So if I get in trouble, I brought something today, finally. So if I do, we'll drag out the cheaters. I'm going to look in Psalm 56 here. And all the Psalms are always so interesting. They're so personal, I think, when you read the Psalms. You know, I think that's why so many times when we have trouble, we go to the Psalms because we can find great comfort there. And I think the Lord, He has designed His Word in that way. And there's such good pictures, there's such good examples that are shared there. I'm going to just share real briefly, every now and then I'll do this, but some of the goals for the lesson when we get to the end of this series is that we should be able to recognize the reality and some of the underlying sources of fears. We're going to talk about fear this morning. That we commonly encounter in life, understand the key components of trust fueled by faith in God, and how such faith leads to renewal in the face of fear, and then appreciate how truth or how faith gives us the ability to stand with confidence and strength to continue for the Lord. So we'll touch a little bit on fear this morning. And that'll lead us right on into how we deal with fear. And I want to get ahead of myself because there's so much things you could say, I guess, early on. But I'm going to try to stick with the lesson itself. So if you want to go to Psalm 56. We're going to begin. We're going to read the only 13 verses in that chapter, and then we'll get into the lesson. So Psalm 56, 1 through 13. David says here, he says, "Be merciful unto me, O God, for man would swallow me up." And some of these things, just as you listen, as we read this, to think on. I've highlighted a few things. I'll share what I've highlighted. I've highlighted there where he says that man would swallow me up. He, fighting daily, oppresseth me. He says, "Mine enemies would daily swallow me up. For they be many that fight against me. O thou Most High," he says, "what time I am afraid, I will trust in thee." And I guess as I read through this, this may be one of my favorite verses that my favorite things that he says here. He says, what time I am afraid, I will trust in thee. In God I will praise his word. In God have I put my trust. I will not fear what flesh can do unto me. Every day they wrest my words. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They gather themselves together. They hide themselves. They mark my steps when they wait for my soul. Shall they escape by iniquity? In thine anger cast down the people of God. O God, thou tellest my wanderings. Put thou my tears into thy bottle. Are they not in thy book? I always thought that was interesting, a reference to the tears that we shed. How important even those are, that God, they're so important that he takes them and puts them in a bottle. And he has a record of those. And I've always said, you may have fears that nobody knows about. You may shed tears that nobody will ever see, but God knows about those things. He knows our fears. And he cares. That's how much he cares for us. When he says, put thou my tears into thy bottle, are they not in thy book? When I cry unto thee, then shall mine enemies turn back. This I know, for God is for me. I've highlighted that. That's a good thing to think on, that God is for me. And then in verse 10, in God will I praise his word. In the Lord will I praise his word. In God have I put my trust. I will not be afraid what man can do unto me. So you see, he grows. He grows. He shares his fears, and then he shows where his trust moves to. So I will not be afraid of what man can do unto me. Thy vows are upon me, O God. I will render praise unto thee. For thou hast delivered my soul. There's that assurance. For thou hast delivered my soul from death. Wilt not thou deliver my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of the living? So this is David. David was in a very hard place in this time in his life. He was running from Saul. He had ran to the Philistines. He had ran to a place called Gath. Saul was after him. There were those there in Gath that were seeking out to find fault in him and to maybe point him out and to take his life. So he was in a very fearful position at this time in his life. You think if you read about David, my stars, what a brave individual he is. You think about his bravery, the things he's done. It talks about the mighty men of valor that he had with him. But here's a picture, a little bit more deeper picture about him, that he is just like everybody else. He had fears himself. He had times when his trust was tested, was challenged. So our lesson asks us a question, and the writer, he says, if I were to ask you, if you trust God, what would you say? Well, he kind of answers it for you. He says, you would probably say yes. And I would think we would probably all say yes, that I do trust God. We'd say, of course I do. But then he points out that the depth of that trust is actually revealed when challenges come into our lives. So it's one thing to say I trust, but it's another thing when life happens, isn't it? It's another thing when we're challenged, when our trust, when our faith is challenged. And that's just the way it is, I believe. And I'll touch on some more, maybe my thoughts on that, on fear. But just some of the things pointed out in this study, we're going to learn that we always have a choice of where to place our trust. And we can either place our trust in ourselves or we can place our trust in the Lord. And I think a lot of times I always just use me as an example. I don't know you all, but what you do in your mind, but I'll say me. Sometimes I get them reversed. When I get in a situation, what can I do? And really it should be the other way around, shouldn't it? It should be, what's the Lord going to do? How's he going to handle this situation? How's he going to move me through this situation? So we can either trust in ourselves or we can trust in the Lord. There's some good examples of this, of things that we can trust. And I like when they always give examples. But he gives an example here. He says when it comes to making decisions sometimes, we're given the advice to trust our guts. You ever been given that advice? Probably gave that advice to somebody. Well, just trust your gut. Well, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't work, does it? But he makes a good point here. We're told to trust our guts. But as authors Chip and Dan Heath pointed out in the book Decisive, our guts are full of questionable advice. And I like his example here. He says, consider the ultimate red velvet cheesecake. And y'all like red velvet cheesecake? We had a preacher that would come in here years back, and some of the ladies in the church had made him a cake. And he didn't call it red velvet, he called it red corduroy. But, that was what he liked it. He liked it. His gut liked that red corduroy cake. It was red velvet, but he liked it. So he goes on, he says, our guts are full of questionable advice. He says, again, consider the ultimate red velvet cheesecake at the Cheesecake Factory. A truly delicious dessert, and one that clocks in at 1,540 calories. So that about knock out your 2,000 calories a day diet, wouldn't it? That's getting some steps in to get rid of that. Which is the equivalent of 3 McDonald's double cheeseburgers plus, just for extra, a pack of Skittles. So this is pretty good. But he says the ultimate red velvet cheesecake is exactly the kind of thing that our guts get excited about. Yet no one would mistake this guidance for wisdom. So our gut may tell us something, but it's not always the best thing, is it? So it's better to say, well, what would the Lord tell me in this situation, rather than going by gut instinct. And I'm not saying that there's not times when we have a sense. Some people say, what's that sixth sense? I think parents have a sixth sense sometimes. It's that when we give that answer because I said so. Your kid, y'all ever do that? I bet we did. I know I did. The girls would want to do something. I said, no. Well, why? Well, I don't know the answer. I'm saying to myself, but it's just because I said so. And that's that sense. And it usually worked out right. I think it's just the good Lord watching over us. So every day, each of us has a choice to make. Will we trust in God, or will we trust in ourselves? Will we rely on God's wisdom or on our own instincts? So it's something we need to be really careful about. And again, I'm not going to hit everything. There's just no way we could. But the Bible gives us a lot of different stories of people who trusted God. And you can go all the way from Genesis to Revelation. You'll find those stories. We're going to focus on the life of one individual, it being David. He's one of the most significant, probably one of the best known. I touched on just a few things that we can look at his life. When we study his life, well, a lot of times we'll think of the shepherd boy that God chose to be king because he was a man after his own heart. He gives a reference of 1 Samuel 13:14. Or we think of the zeal that he displayed when he asked the men of Israel who were being taunted by Goliath, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of God? I like the other question he asked too. Is there not a cause? Is there not a reason that we should stand up to this Philistine? That's 1 Samuel 17:26. And then the reference to the courage with which he stood before the giant, armed with nothing but a slingshot, a few stones, and an unshakable faith in the God who would secure a mighty victory over the enemy. If you want to read there, 1 Samuel 17, verses 40 through 51. I'll tell you what, something else I would encourage you to look into the how those slings were used. I mean, my stars, what a weapon in the hands of somebody who knew how to use it. And I've watched a few videos on people that use them even today. But David was depending on the Lord for this. So he had times of failure also and fear. And there's references to that, which I touched on, how that when Saul was in pursuit of him, he went into to the place called Gath. He went in amongst the Philistines. He went to the cave of Adullam near the Dead Sea. and there was going to be some 400 men that would eventually come to him and be a part of his fighting force. So the title for Psalm 56, and I like that they put details about these things. Now, as you read I don't know if your Bible has it, but mine has the title of the psalm, and it says, to the chief musician, a big long word, big long name, so I don't know if I can pronounce it, but I'll try. It says, upon Joneth Elim Tokum, I'll say it that way, it's probably not right. Then the next word is the word Miktam, David, when the Philistines took him in Gath. So that's the title that he has gave this psalm. Brother Chappell, they had put in our notes talking about that name and what it means. The Hebrew word, that big long J word there that I used, I don't want to butcher it again, which likely refers to the melody to which the psalm was meant to be sung, means the silent dove of far-off places. Y'all ever heard of dove? Now, I've been out working in places, and there'd be a lot going on, and you'd hear a dove, and it's just like there was almost a stillness would come over. I don't know. That's the way I hear them. There'd be a stillness in the air for just a moment or two, when you hear that dove. So that's been my experience. But he talks about the silent dove of far-off places, hiding from those who would take his life. He says that David felt like a dove in the hands of strangers, weak, vulnerable, and desperate. And he asked the question, have you ever felt that way? And I'm sure we all have. We felt like we're just at the world's, whatever they want to do with us sometimes. What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to those that I care for? So we all have those things. So we'll take a close look at Psalm 56 to see how David dealt with the fear that he experienced and how he was ultimately able to trust God and experience his peace. We too can experience the same rest and the same peace. I've added a few notes. I'll always try to take a little bit of something. I can't spare much out of my mind, but a little bit. But I put this statement here. I put, be wary of those that say they fear nothing. I'm always kind of wary of somebody that says that, because I've never found it to be completely true. Now, I've had people say that, and really, they may have not been afraid of anything, but it was because a lot of times they were not right. There was something wrong with that individual. Fear is healthy. Thank the Lord that we have fear in our lives, but it's what we do with that fear, isn't it? I fear, there's certain things I fear. I do some woodworking. I have a very healthy fear of a table saw because I know what that table saw can do. I've saw what it can do. Brother Larry, you may have saw some things, some of y'all over the years, what can a skill saw do? I'm even fearful of a mixer in the kitchen. Good, healthy fear. So fear is a good thing to have. And if for no other reason, because God says, what does he say in Hebrews 10:31? He said it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. I believe that should cause some fear, even in the life of a believer, to know that we could fall into the hands of a holy God. That should strike some fear. And I think, we can look at that. The Bible says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. There's that reverence that we should have. And I think fear is that seed for reverence that we have. I was thinking about the military. I like to read a lot of history. I've read a lot of history about World War II. And you hear the personal stories of just those, we'd say those men that went up onto the beaches of Normandy. I just happened to catch a little. It was Bruce Dern, the actor. He's been dead several years, but he went onto the beaches of Normandy. And I think he was the only one that survived, if I remember correctly, out of his company. That's a lot of men. He said when the gate dropped on the landing craft, they were supposed to be able to walk up on the beach. He said, we ended up in 60 feet of water, sunk to the bottom like a rock, had 60 pounds of weight, gear on him. He said the man to the left was killed immediately. The one behind him was killed immediately. His sergeant, when they got up on the beach, he said, "Do you want me to go ahead first, or do you want to go ahead?" His sergeant said, "You go." He said he went forward. Explosion happened behind him. He looked back. Don't want to gross you out, but part of the sergeant was here and part of the sergeant was there. And he got up on the beach and he had somebody ask him, another leader, "Are you afraid?" And he said, "Yes, I'm afraid." And he said, "Well, good, because we all are." And they were all had fear, didn't they? And you read the stories about these people. A lot of these, they talked, and I can't fault them for this, but they talked a big talk until the bullets started flying. And then when your life is in danger and you see others dying around you, that changes everything, doesn't it? So everybody has that place that they can have fear. And God knows how to bring that fear. I thought about Peter there in Matthew chapter 14. You know, I remember the story of Peter when the Lord told him to come out and come to him. Y'all remember that? I'm sure you do. But Matthew chapter 14, Peter was I would say he was very brave to do what he did. Verse 32, let's read verse 30. It says, but when he saw, Peter had stepped out on the water, but when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." So even Peter, even in the very presence of the Lord, had fear. And we are the same way. We can have fears in the very presence of the Lord. Now, I don't know, I like to pick little things out. As I read this again last night, I like that it says, and beginning to sink. It doesn't say that he sunk. When he saw, and this is good, I think a good lesson for me anyhow, is that when he saw that he was sinking, he immediately said, "Lord, save me." And what's sad, a lot of times in our lives, we'll just go ahead and sink to the bottom, won't we? And then it's a mess. So when we see ourselves sinking, we should immediately say, "Lord, save me." We should immediately go to the Lord and ask Him for His help. So that's our first point in our lesson is the reality of fear. And each of us will have times of fear. Notice that David, he did not say, "If I am afraid." He said, essentially, he said, "When," or he said, "What time I am afraid." So he knew that he had fears within himself. He may have kept them hid, but he knew that he had personal fears. He knew that there was going to be fear in his life. It's just like when we have trials and temptations there in James. He doesn't say if you fall into diverse temptations. He says when you fall into diverse temptations, when you have trials in your life. So he's referenced in verse 3 there in Psalm 56. Again, he says, "What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee." So that's such a good statement, isn't it? And when we have fear, that should be our goal, our statement. "I will trust in thee." And boy, that takes some focus in our lives. When we have fear in our lives, we have to focus. It's look at me. It's just like Peter. He had to look at the Lord, didn't he? He had to keep his eyes on the Lord and not on those things that were bringing fear in his life, not the winds and the water, the things that were causing him to have fear. But again, our lesson talks about a broken world, experiences of fear are inevitable. And he says there's no sin involved in feeling fear. The sin, and he makes a good point here. He says the sin comes when we choose to remain in a state of constant fear. It's one thing to fear, but we should not stay there. We should not stay in that place. We should be able to move forward as Christians. There are a lot of reasons he gives that fear might grip our hearts. I think a lot of these are very true. He says, for one, maybe not so much for us. Do you ever quit raising your kids? We really don't do it. We always give them a little bit of advice here, and, sometimes they want it, sometimes they don't. But he talks about raising children. That can be a fearful thing. But raising children, he talks about how raising children in a media-saturated culture. I mean, there's so much that our kids face that we never had to face. I was watching something on Gen Xers, so that would be my generation. I think it's from born in 65 through 80, somewhere, something like that. And our generation, just the things that we didn't have, and Brother Larry, did y'all have the internet? No. You hollered at the neighbors, did, hey, what's going on? No phone. So the things that we didn't have, the communications that we didn't have, and just how resilient we had to be. We didn't have the things that our kids are confronted with today. That's what I want to say. They're confronted with a lot of things, and I think we need to take it in. And that's a very scary thing, I believe. I've got a grandson. I've got 2 granddaughters. And to think of the things that they're faced with. And we want to give them the right advice. So that can cause fear. Economic uncertainty, that can cause fear. Threats against our religious liberty, that can cause fear. And these are all things that can cause fear. I'm not saying they can't be overcome, but they can cause fear. Mounting bills, ridicule for your faith. And David, well, he was afraid for his very life, wasn't he? So we all have different types of fears in our lives. You could put whatever you need to in that list. But David talks about that all this was going on, and it was going on in the presence of enemies. He says in verse 2, he says that his enemies were many. There in Psalm 56:2, he says, mine enemies would daily swallow me up, for they be many that fight against me, O thou most high. So he's pleading his case. This psalm is actually a prayer of David to the Lord. He's praying this to the Lord. This is his interaction. He's going in his prayer closet and having this conversation with the Lord. And he says, mine enemies would daily swallow me up, for they be many that fight against me, O thou most high. And he brings us to remember where David is at this time. He is in Philistia after fleeing from Saul. He has been befriended by Achish, but again, he's still surrounded on all sides by his enemies. So all around David is hatred for him, and he says in verse 1 again, he says, man would swallow me up by fighting daily. He fighting daily oppresseth me. So again, we need to think about ourselves also when we forget about this. But it's a good reminder. He tells us that we too are always in the presence of our ultimate enemy. Who is that? Who is it that is constantly seeking out a way to cause fear to come into our life? It's the old devil, isn't it? It's Satan himself. And I put myself a note here. I said, be aware of this. Be aware that your enemy, the devil, our enemy, the devil, is constantly in pursuit of whatever he can get from us, whatever he can take from our lives that brings us joy, that brings us peace, that brings us comfort. He's constantly in pursuit of those things. And we need to be aware of that. I'm not saying try to confront him, but don't do that. Let the Lord do that. But need to be aware. So he talks about that we're always in the presence of our ultimate enemy, Satan, and we're called to constant vigilance. 1 Peter 5:8. I know this verse, I'm sure. But he says, be sober. He says, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. So that's constant. That's day in and that's day out, that he is looking for opportunity in our lives. And then he talks about the plot of our enemies. Now, Lisa's not here, so we won't get a buzzer, so I'll just have to watch that clock. That thing's working, isn't it, Bro Don? Or is it? Did I just pick it the one time that it's right twice a day? Okay. But so he talks about the plot, David does, of the enemies. Well, what can you say about the enemies? Well, first of all, they're untruthful. Did you know that your enemies will lie about you? Did you know that your enemies will take your words and twist them and make them into something that you didn't even come close to saying? And he points that out. And David had that same problem in his life. or the writer talks about how the enemies of the righteous speak untruths about God and his children. And they do. You know, sometimes they can take a truth and really, by leaving the other facts out, it becomes a lie. Now, I think if this comes to my mind when we hear people say God is love, and they won't say anything else. And they'll use that. They'll try to use that, but they forget where it says that God is a God of wrath. Also, he is a God of love. He is love, but he's also a God of wrath. So that's twisting God's word by omission, by leaving something out. And that's what our enemies will do. He says there in Psalm 6:5, he says, every day they wrest my words, all their thoughts are against me for evil. I had to look up in the Hebrew what the word rest. I just wanted to make sure I was understanding. I thought I did. But that word rest, it means they fabricate or they fashion. They take your words, but they'll twist them and use them in different ways that you never intended. They'll use them in the wrong way. They'll use them against you. You know, it's just like when you're talking somebody, if you're being interrogated, you know, they say everything you say can and will be used against you. Well, that's how our enemies look at it too. Everything you say can and will be used against you. So they're very untruthful. And David's enemies, they were doing this to him. They were taking his words out of context. They were misrepresenting them to further their own purposes. And I want to try to get to an example, and we'll probably have to stop there. So we're talking about their enemies are untruthful. And his enemies that David had were untruthful. So he says, similarly, the enemy misrepresents the righteous even today. Those who are set against God will ridicule Christians who take a stand for Christ or who attempt to consistently live out their faith. I think that makes me think of the word bigot. You know, if you're against a lot of the things today that are ungodly and clearly God says that are wrong, you become a bigot. But I tell people you need to look up the word bigot and see what it means. And it might be the other way around, but that is a label that we will get as Christians for standing for our faith. But the example he gives, he says, when Mike Pence was the Vice President of the United States, it became known that he had a personal policy to not spend lengthy time alone, such as sharing a meal with a woman who was not his wife. He says, for days, the media ruthlessly ridiculed this safeguard he had placed in his life to honor his marriage and to protect his reputation. I don't remember that, but you know, the media, that's what they'll do, won't they? They'll take things that are good and right, and they'll try to twist them into something that is so far from the truth. But God tells us as Christians that we're to avoid even the appearance of evil. It should not even be questioned of what our character is and what we're doing, even if it's in a public place. So he points out, he says that times may change. Very true, times may change, but the enemy's tactics do not. They don't. So David was dealing with a lot of the same things that we deal with also. So our next thought, I think maybe on your notes, I looked briefly through the student book, and I'll be honest, I'll try to hit the topics in the handout. I won't promise you anything. But the next thing we'll look at is the enemies is that they're unscrupulous. And that word unscrupulous means having or showing no moral principles, not honest or fair. That's unscrupulous. So be thinking about that. That'll be a reference to Psalm 56, verse 6. So I'm going to guess I'm definitely out of time. So we got off to a slow start, but Lord willing, we'll pick up some speed next week. Thank you all.